Prior to the start of the Civil War, Washington was deeply focused on the issues of secession and emancipation. The U.S. Capitol Historical Society presented a conference recently about the looming war's impact in the nation's capital. The following program is about 50 minutes.
We'll begin this afternoon with I guess for those of you who were not here earlier, I'm Paul Finkelman from Albany Law School in Albany, New York, and I am the coordinator of this conference, and so you will see me popping up and down to introduce each of the speakers and then to close us later on in the day. My other co-coordinator is Don Kennan, who's in the back of the room, and stand up and at least wave to us, Don, because really I make the phone calls and bring speakers. Don does everything else. It's a great partnership, and he's responsible for the venue and all of the other things that happen today. We're going to begin this afternoon with a keynote address by James Oakes, who received his PhD under one of the great scholars of antebellum America, Kenneth Stamp. He received his PhD in 1981 from the University of California at Berkeley. In 1979, more importantly, James published an article in Civil War History, and it was the second article in the journal. The lead article was mine, and I got this journal, and I thought, you know, this graduate student at Berkeley, he might have some promise. He seems pretty good. I was, of course, only a couple of years out of grad school at the time, so I could look at this fellow. And now, of course, he holds an endowed chair at the City University of New York. He's the author of The Ruling Race, A History of American Slaveholders, the author of Slavery and Freedom in 1990, and most recently and most importantly, in 2007, published The Radical and the Republican, a book about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, which, among other things, won the Abraham Lincoln Prize, which is become, I think, for the internal understanding of scholarship, the premier prize in this area. There are many prizes given for many things, but the Lincoln Prize and the Frederick Douglass Prize, both given by through the Gilder Lehrman Institute in New York, are prizes where the juries are scholars who recommend books to a committee of people who are both scholars and true advocates of history. And in that sense, I think it's a prize that everybody is always thinking, I wish I could have gotten that prize. His current project is Out of the Darkness, Emancipation in the United States, and that's what Jim is going to speak to us on. And I'm delighted to have my old friend and co-author in a journal from before we even knew each other, Jim Oakes.
We're running late, and I have a 45-minute talk to give, so I'm just going to get started. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also an honor, but as I say, we're a little late, so let me go. Abraham Lincoln was explaining why it was so preposterous for a state to secede just because he'd been elected president. It was March 4th, 1861, Inauguration Day, and already 7 slave states had left the Union to form the Confederacy. Lincoln thought secession was illegal, the essence of anarchy, he called it. But he also thought there was no good reason for it. After all, neither he nor any Republican had ever claimed that the federal government had the power to abolish slavery in any state. Lincoln had said this several times before, and in fact, he quoted himself in his inaugural address. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists, he said. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. To underscore the point, Lincoln indicated that he would have no objection to a constitutional amendment that would forever ban the federal government from abolishing slavery in any state where it was legal. These passages from the first inaugural are favorites among those historians who are inclined to doubt that the North went to war over slavery. Lincoln's own words, they say, prove that he cared more about the Union than he did about slavery, that to appease the South he was prepared to jettison whatever anti-slavery convictions he may have had. Citing the inaugural promise not to interfere with slavery, historian Paul Escott concludes that, quote, the initial policy of the Lincoln administration was to leave African Americans exactly as the Confederates wanted them, enslaved. George Frederickson drew a nearly identical conclusion. Quote, in the United States that Lincoln addressed in his first inaugural of March 1861, abolition seemed a very distant prospect, and the new president indicated his willingness to accept a proposed unamendable amendment to the Constitution that would explicitly forbid the federal government from interfering slavery in the southern states, According to Ira Berlin, the official pronouncements of Lincoln, his cabinet, and his generals demonstrated that, as far as they were concerned, quote, the conflict between the North and the South was a war for national union in which black people had no place. Harsher still is the verdict rendered by John Stauffer. The fact that Lincoln had no objection to a constitutional amendment forever recognizing slavery in the states was, Stauffer writes, quote, intellectually and morally dishonest, for it negated Lincoln's belief in the ultimate extinction of slavery. In that one sentence, Stauffer concludes, Lincoln, quote, agreed to desecrate the Constitution, end quote. For these historians, Lincoln's inaugural recognition of the constitutionality of slavery in the states stands as a double indictment of the Northern war aims and of Lincoln himself. Yet, as numerous scholars, most recently Paul Finkelman, have pointed out, there was nothing at all extraordinary about what Lincoln said in his inaugural address. In 1860, almost everybody, including almost nearly all abolitionists, agreed that the Constitution protected slavery in the states where it already existed. A constitutional amendment saying so changed nothing. It was one of those bogus proposals for sectional reconciliation that Republicans were tossing out in public, even as they admitted in private that it was all political posturing, designed to make it look as though they were conciliatory when in fact they were not. Kenneth Stamp called this, quote, the fraud of the conciliators, end quote. Moreover, anyone familiar with the history of the anti-slavery movement in the United States would recognize Lincoln's statement as a commonplace even among radicals. In the magnificent anti-slavery speech that Senator Thomas Morris of Ohio delivered in February 1839, the speech that got him expelled from the Democratic Party, Morris acknowledged that, quote, the Constitution left the subject of slavery to the states, end quote. Joshua Giddings, who was nearly expelled from the Whig Party for his radical opposition to slavery, took a similar state rights position. With the adoption of the Constitution, Giddings wrote, quote, slavery was made strictly a state institution. As such, the right of the northern states to abolish slavery and the slave trade, quote, is as supreme, absolute, and unconditional as is the right of the slave states to maintain them. When opponents of slavery argued that the Constitution recognized slavery in the states where it existed, they were not defending slavery, they were restricting it, limiting its reach. Hence the popular anti-slavery slogan made famous by Charles Sumner, the dean of the Senate Radicals, in a speech called Freedom National, Slavery Local. Salmon Chase, the most radical member of Lincoln's cabinet, had been developing this line of attack since at least the 1830s. It took positive legislation enacted by states, he argued, to create a right to own slaves. But it was a right, Chase explained, that, quote, can have no existence beyond the territorial limits of the state which sanctions it, end quote. For most abolitionists, the Constitution recognized slavery as a state institution, but only as a state institution. As a pioneering historian of abolitionism once put it, the main body of the anti-slavery movement, quote, never deviated from the position that Congress could not, by direct legislation, constitutionally abolish slavery in the southern states. So when Lincoln vowed in his first inaugural address not to interfere with slavery in the states where it existed, he was reciting a principle common to nearly all abolitionists. By itself, therefore, his promise of non-interference does not indicate and cannot prove that at the time the war began, Lincoln believed slavery was irrelevant to the struggle, that the war had nothing to do with blacks, or that emancipation was at that point inconceivable. But it does raise a question. If nearly every opponent of slavery agreed that the federal government could not abolish slavery in the states, How did they expect to get slavery abolished? This turns out to be an easy question to answer, because in the 5 months between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and the beginning of the war in April 1861, a full-scale debate over emancipation erupted nationwide. And in that debate, Republicans revealed not only that they expected slavery to be abolished, but explained precisely how they thought it was going to happen. Moreover, the Republican argument about how emancipation would happen changed dramatically over the course of the Secession winter. In the immediate aftermath of their electoral victory in November, Republicans assumed that they would be able to squeeze slavery to death gradually but inexorably. Once the Deep South states had seceded from the Union, however, Republicans argued that slavery would be abolished in the rebellious states quickly and violently. Secession meant war, and war meant emancipation, immediate emancipation. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated, virtually all Republicans believed this. The secession crisis will be, quote, decisive as to the supremacy of slavery, a Republican editor in Massachusetts explained in late December. Either the South will remain within the Union, in which case slavery will die out gradually and quietly, or the South will leave the Union, thereby subjecting slavery to, quote, constant peril and strife until it will be pretty certain to come to a violent and bloody death, end quote. Whichever way events turned, slavery was finished. How was this possible? What were the Republicans thinking? In January of 1861, Horace Greeley, the Republican editor of the influential New York Tribune, published the details of his plan to have the federal government purchase at $400 apiece and then emancipate every slave in the states surrounding the Cotton South, Delaware and Maryland, plus the westernmost states running southward from Missouri and Arkansas through Louisiana and Texas. The emancipated slaves would then be colonized somewhere outside the United States. Hemmed in and suffocated by this cordon of free states, slavery would deteriorate rapidly in the rest of the South. Quote, rent by internal discords and jealousies, Greeley predicted, the seceding states will, one by one, abolish slavery and return to the Union. Greeley's proposal elicited nationwide comment, but no objections among Republicans. For months, even before the November elections, Republicans across the North were giddily predicting the abolition of slavery in the South. With Abraham Lincoln as president and with wider Republican margins in Congress, the long reign of the slave power would be over. Although prohibited by the Constitution from interfering directly with slavery in the states where it already existed, the federal government would nevertheless do all it could to squeeze slavery out of existence by interfering with it indirectly. This meant several things. At the very least, slavery would be banned from all the Western territories and no new slave states would be admitted to the Union. With the addition of each new free state, the already weakened power of the slaveholding oligarchy would diminish still further. Congress would abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and repeal the despised Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. New appointments to the Supreme Court would transform America's highest judicial tribunal, shifting it from a pro-slavery to an anti-slavery bias. Free speech would be restored to the South, which could only mean that postmasters would no longer interrupt the flow of abolitionist pamphlets into the slave states. As the slave power withered, anti-slavery policy would become more aggressive. For years, Chase had been urging Congress to regulate the domestic slave trade by taxing every slave sold across state lines and by outlawing the coastwise slave trade entirely. Republicans would implement Greeley's plan to purchase and then emancipate all the slaves in the border states, with or without colonization. Squeezed down into the Gulf states, denied for access to fresh Western soils, deprived of the life-giving support of federal power, slavery, even in the Cotton South, would soon become unprofitable and maybe even dangerous. A homegrown anti-slavery movement would spring up within the remaining slave states. It might take a while, although Republicans expected that emancipation, accelerating over time, would largely be accomplished within a generation. However long it took, and by whatever combination of means, Lincoln's promise would be fulfilled. If the Republicans won the 1860 election, slavery would be placed where it belonged, quote, on the course of ultimate extinction. A Republican newspaper in Chicago predicted in dramatic detail what would happen if the party were to win in November. Quote, "We will surround them with a cordon of free states, and as with a wall of fire. We will hem them in on all sides by free and happy communities. Deprived of the aid of the general government and thrown upon itself for support, slavery must gradually die out. Southerners would get anti-slavery literature in the mail. Missouri and Delaware would soon become free states, and slavery, quote, confined to its present limits, will become unprofitable and a pecuniary as well as a moral curse. Then emancipation societies will spring up in all the slave states, and the blessed work will go on until the last slave is free. The child is now born," the editors proclaimed, quote, "who will live to see the emancipation of the last slave upon the American continent." And yet, all of this would happen, the editors insisted, within the limits prescribed by the Constitution. After the Republicans take power, the slave states will be allowed to keep their barbarous system. We will let them alone, end quote. But this was true only in the narrow sense that Congress would not directly abolish slavery in the states where it already existed. There was nothing to stop the federal government from fatally undermining slavery by attacking it indirectly. Most Republicans agreed with William Seward, the powerful New York senator, that slavery was an irrational economic system kept artificially alive by steady infusions of federal support funneled to the slaveholders thanks to the disproportionate influence of the slave power which had, for decades, maintained a vice-like grip on the Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. If not for the sustenance of the slave power, Southern blacks would have been restored to their natural condition of freedom long before. But Lincoln's election signaled the downfall of the slave power, and with it, Seward declared, quote, the downfall of slavery itself. A few days after the election, Salmon Chase, soon to become Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, wrote that one of the great objects of his life, quote, the overthrow of the slave power, is now happily accomplished. So long as Republicans held fast to their convictions and implemented the policies to which the party was committed, Chase believed slavery was doomed. Republicans may not have secured majority control of Congress, but they had overthrown the slave power, tilted the government toward freedom, and thereby sealed slavery's fate. Southerners were persuaded. By 1860, they agreed that once in power, the Republicans would try to abolish slavery, however indirectly, everywhere in the South. Historians often treat the secessionist rhetoric as a species of hysteria, as though they were fantasizing improbable Republican depredations, when in fact, all the secessionists were doing was taking Republicans at their word. Southern editorials often read like mirror images of Northern editorials. The Kentucky Statesman warned readers that with control of Congress, Republicans would repeal the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. They would, in impudent defiance of the U.S. Supreme Court, exclude slavery from all the Western territories. And that was only the beginning. They would block the admission of new slave states, abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and exclude it from all federal property, forts, dockyards, and arsenals within the South. Eventually, Republicans would ban the interstate slave trade. If their party shall succeed in attaining control of the government, the statesman warned, its history leaves no doubt that it will undertake to carry out all these purposes. And with that, the slave states would have no choice but to secede from the Union. With good reason, secessionists waved aside Northern promises not to interfere with slavery directly in the states where it already existed. Quote, where they cannot attack it in the states, they will attack it at every other point they can reach, a Louisiana paper argued. Quote, they will set fire to all the surrounding buildings in the hope that some spark may catch, and everything be destroyed in a general conflagration. They will undermine the pillars of the institution and then wait quietly for the whole edifice to tumble. As North Carolina Representative Zebulon Vance pointed out, Republican proposals were explicitly designed to force abolition of slavery by the Southern states themselves. Do you not call this interference? Vance asked. You are interfering. And in so doing, he added, Republicans, quote, violate one of the oldest and plainest principles of justice and reason, that you cannot do indirectly what you are forbidden to do directly. Lincoln's election would bring with it, quote, no direct act of violence against Negro property, the Richmond, Virginia Enquirer pointed out. Instead, the Republicans would go after slavery indirectly. Quote, under the fostering hand of federal power, abolitionism would insidiously plant itself in the border states, quote, converting them into free states, then into cities of refuge for runaway Negroes from the Gulf states. The Republicans would accomplish all of this while remaining technically true to their promises not to interfere with slavery directly in the southern states. Quote, no act of violence may ever be committed, no servile war waged, and yet the ruin and degradation of Virginia will be as fully and as fatally accomplished as though bloodshed and rapine had ravished the land. It was all true. That is precisely what the Republicans intended. Across the South, avid secessionists and cautious cooperationists read Republican plans the same way. I'm going to skip here. For all its secessionist zeal, the Charleston Mercury was in some ways remarkably clear-headed. On the eve of the election, it put the matter bluntly. The issue before the country is the extinction of slavery. If the Republicans win, the only way to protect the South was to leave the Union, which is precisely what the Cotton States of the Lower South did. The secessionist movement began in South Carolina within weeks of Lincoln's election, and by Christmas, the Palmetto State had declared itself divorced from the Union. But the remaining states of the Deep South hardly needed South Carolina's coaxing. Beginning in early January and continuing into February, all the Cotton States, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana and Texas, seceded from the Union. By February, they had come together to form the Confederacy under a new constitution with an interim president, Jefferson Davis, a wealthy cotton planter from Mississippi. And it was all because Abraham Lincoln had been elected president. They were right to worry about him. Any slaveholder who got his hands on a copy of Lincoln's Cooper Union address of the previous February could easily see why his election was a direct threat to the South's peculiar institution. It was a fairly long speech and somewhat dry, but it had a dramatic point. There is no such thing, Lincoln insisted, as a constitutional right of property in slaves. Contrary to what Chief Justice Roger Taney had declared in the Dred Scott decision, contrary to what all slaveholders believed, a right of property in slaves is nowhere to be found expressly or even implicitly in the text of the Constitution. Instead, the Constitution repeatedly referred to slaves as persons, not as property. This was no mere verbal slip on the founders' part, Lincoln argued. Rather, the men who drafted the nation's founding charter had gone out of their way to avoid any reference to slaves as property. The Constitution did protect slavery in the states where it existed, but only under the principles of federalism, not as a fundamental right of property. It was a very important distinction. It meant that the constitutional protection of slavery did not extend beyond the limits of the states where it was legal. It did not extend into the territories, for example, or to Washington, D.C., and certainly not into the free states. In denying the right of property in slaves, Lincoln was doing what every abolitionist had been doing for 30 years, restricting slavery to the states where it already existed. After his address at Cooper Union, Lincoln toured New England, giving different versions of the same speech. Then he shut up. Not literally shut up. The great presidential addresses and letters were still to come, but they tended to be brief statements of general principles. Cooper Union was the last speech Lincoln ever gave explaining in detail his position on slavery. It was, in fact, the last of an extended series of speeches that began back in Peoria in 1854, a body of words that allows us to recreate in detail the contours of Lincoln's argument against slavery and to trace the way his thinking developed over the course of the 1850s. But after Cooper Union, there were no more speeches spelling out his position on slavery, and, still more frustrating, Lincoln never gave a single speech explaining his position on emancipation. much less a series of speeches that would allow us to trace the development of his thinking once he was elected. Cooper Union was part of Lincoln's bid for the 1860 Republican presidential nomination. Afterward, in keeping with the electoral practices of the day, Lincoln went home to Springfield and stopped talking in public. Throughout the race for the nomination, through the fall presidential campaign, and even through the entire secession winter until his inauguration, Lincoln did not give a single major speech. He let leak private indications of where he stood on the legality of secession and the danger of compromising with secessionists, and he made a number of brief public statements to that effect while en route from Springfield to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. But otherwise, he remained silent during some of the most turbulent months of American political history. In those months, between his election and his inauguration, public opinion, North and South, shifted dramatically, as did the position most Republicans took on slavery and emancipation. It would be foolish to assume that Lincoln did not move as Republicans moved. He was nothing if not a party man. Yet, curiously, his silence makes Abraham Lincoln the least useful politician by which to gauge the dramatic transformation in Republican thought. Because of Lincoln's silence during the secession winter, all eyes were focused instead on another leading Republican politician of the day, William Seward, soon to leave the Senate to become Lincoln's Secretary of State. Long viewed as an ideological spokesman for his party, one of those who had worked hardest to formulate and popularize its positions on slavery, Seward had been a favorite to win the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. Yet, despite his loss to Lincoln, Seward was still recognized as one of the party's most important leaders. That he was about to become Lincoln's Secretary of State did nothing to diminish Seward's stature. Many assumed that his was the public voice of the incoming administration. As a result, while Lincoln remained silent during the secession winter, everyone turned their attention to the major statement Seward planned to make in the Senate on January 12, 1861. It was a critical moment. Alabama and Florida had seceded the day before, Mississippi 2 days before that. Within a few weeks, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas would be gone as well. What would Seward have to say about this? Would he, like most of his fellow Republicans, stand his ground and refuse to compromise with the secessionists? Or would Seward offer the South concessions that would save the Union? Seward conceded nothing. His tone was conciliatory, his prose was obscure, but his substance was unyielding. Indeed, the speech included an understated but unmistakable warning to Southern secessionists. If it comes to war, if the North has to invade the South to enforce the law, the result, said Seward, would be slave rebellion. This was a struggle over slavery, he argued, and what's more, the slaves knew it. Quote, freedom is to them, as to all mankind, the chief object of desire. When, with a flagrant civil war raging all about them, can anyone expect that the slaves will remain stupid and idle spectators? Of course not, Seward answered. All of human history teaches what the slaves will do in the midst of civil war. An uprising and ferocious African slave population, numbering in the millions, will overwhelm the South, and the entire slave system will come crashing down. There were only two ways to abolish slavery, Seward explained. The American way, which achieves emancipation gradually by closing off access to the African slave trade and restricting slavery to those states where it already exists. As slavery weakens, the slave states themselves eventually realize that they must abolish slavery on their own. This was the path he and the Republicans planned on pursuing. So long as the slave states remained within the Union, the United States would follow the American path. But there was a second, European path by which, quote, direct abolition would be effected if need be by compulsion, end quote. If the South secedes, if dissolution prevails, Seward asked, what guarantee shall there be against the full development here of the fearful and uncompromising hostility to slavery which elsewhere pervades the world, end quote. Secession meant war, Seward warned, and war promised swift, violent emancipation. Seward's speech exposed how dramatically secession had revolutionized the way Republicans talked about emancipation. Once the slave states left the Union, a gradual emancipation was no longer an option except in the border states that remained loyal. Instead of inexorable strangulation, Republicans declared slavery in the seceded states would die a rapid and violent death. Disunion cannot extend slavery into the territories, Chase warned. Quote, disunion, rather, is abolition, and abolition through civil and servile war, which, God forbid. Secessionists left the Union to protect the South from emancipation. Republicans responded by declaring that secession itself made the swift abolition of slavery inevitable. Northern threats of abolition rose in tandem with secessionism in the lower South. The very idea of secession is utterly preposterous, one Lincoln paper in Boston declared shortly after his victory was announced. Quote, the only results to the rebellious states would be a bloody strife confined entirely to their own territory and the immediate and violent abolition of slavery, end quote. Among those who had always hated slavery, the Indianapolis Daily Journal observed a few days before South Carolina seceded, there is some satisfaction in the knowledge that, quote, the dissolution of the American Union seals the doom of American slavery. By the beginning of 1861, Republican editors and politicians across the North were agreed that secession was the death of slavery. The dissolution of the Union is, quote, the most effectual way to bring about the enfranchisement of every slave on this continent, the Iowa State Register explained in late January. Secession will fail, a Republican editor in Springfield, Illinois declared. Quote, universal liberty is to be the eventual law of this land. Slaveholding traitors are only hastening the day when that law shall take effect. If the Union is destroyed, the Bloomington, Illinois Pantagraph warned, quote, one may foresee that American slavery is destined to die a bloody death and to come sooner and suddenly to a tragical termination. It will not be in the power of man to avert it, end quote. This startling eruption of Republican abolitionism presented the slaveholders with an impossible choice. If they remained within the Union, Republicans promised to abolish slavery gradually. But if they seceded from the Union, Republicans predicted a swift and brutal emancipation. In the Union, a Massachusetts paper explained, quote, slavery will live longer and die more gradually and quietly. Out of the Union, its life will come under constant peril, and like all great criminals, it will be pretty certain to come to a violent and bloody end, end quote. Republicans thus responded to secession by dramatically modifying their earlier plans for slavery's eventual abolition. There was a legal logic to this Republican shift. Most Americans agreed that the Constitution recognized slavery in the states. But what if a state left the Union, repudiated the Constitution, and effectively ceased to be a state? When that happened, Republicans argued, slavery forfeited the constitutional protection it enjoyed within the Union. Suppose the southern states go out of the Union to escape northern aversion to slavery, one Republican explained. That would, quote, free the North from all the constitutional restraints that now limit its action, end quote. An Indiana paper was even more emphatic that the North was constitutionally liberated from slavery by secession. Quote, no more protection then, it declared, no more fugitive slave laws, no more right of transit, no more suppressing slave insurrections with federal troops, end quote. It was remarkable how many Republicans began predicting slave rebellion in the South. Once the Union Army launched its war against secession, the slave states, even joined together in a confederacy, quote, have not the means within themselves to keep their Negroes in subjection in such a contest, end quote. Secessionists must consider the Negro element, the Worcester Palladium warned. Quote, God only knows what that element would accomplish should it sweep over the land in the form of an ungovernable insurrection. It may be true that the slaves were loyal, quote, loyal and obsequious to their masters under ordinary circumstances, a pro-Lincoln paper in Kansas argued, but, quote, we cannot escape the great facts which the history of this race reveals, that the black race perceive and deeply feel their wrongs, and when a fitting opportunity affords, will revenge them in the most implacable manner. Thus, the Union invasion of the South would be the catalyst for slavery's destruction. In January 1861, Neal Dow, a prominent anti-slavery advocate from Maine, predicted that Northern troops who invaded the South to restore law and order would not return, quote, until the question of slavery should be settled forever, end quote. If Southerners did not abandon their treasonable operations, Daniel Soames warned, slavery would, quote, go out in blood. The more radical Republicans openly embraced this prospect. If we must go to war, Elihu Washburn argued in the middle of the secession crisis, quote, we shall have the consolation of knowing that when the conflict is over, those who survive it will be the inhabitants of a free country, end quote. When Republicans made such statements, they were not merely predicting the future. They were issuing threats. Leave the Union, they warned, and you will lose your slaves. If the South refuses to accept the results of a legitimate presidential election, if, quote, she must rule this government as she rules her blacks at home, according to her own selfish schemes, then indeed anyone may foresee that American slavery is destined to die a bloody death, end quote. Republicans were not uniformly gleeful about the prospect of brutal slave uprisings. Party conservatives shuddered at the thought even as they predicted it. Senator John Sherman of Ohio, as conciliatory a Republican as there was during the secession crisis, urged Southerners to hold on a little while before they seceded from the Union. They would find no injury coming from the Republicans, he wrote, quote, unless by their misrepresentation of us they stirred up their slaves into insurrection. A few months later, in mid-March, Edward Bates, Lincoln's conservative attorney general, was, quote, convinced that flagrant civil war in the southern states would soon become a social war, and that could hardly fail to bring on a servile war. This was not something Bates wanted to happen, but the mere fact that he envisioned it indicates how widely slave insurrection was being discussed among Republicans. Nor was Bates the only conservative to contemplate an insurrectionary emancipation. On April 18th, fuming over Jefferson Davis's declaration that privateers would be licensed to attack Northern ships, George Templeton Strong, the conservative New York diarist, thought emancipation was the appropriate response. Very well, he wrote, quote, then we shall have no scruples about retaliating on Southern property, which is peculiar for possessing a capacity for being invited to go away, and legs to take itself off, and arms wherewith to use such implements as may aid it in so doing, end quote. As the war commenced, then, it was not at all unusual for Republicans to speak, sometimes in horror, but often with equanimity, of servile insurrection as the terrible fate that the slave states had brought upon themselves. No Republican argued that the North should invade the South with the intention of provoking slaves into rebellion, but that secession meant war, and that war meant slave rebellion, few Republicans disputed. Once it was clear that Republicans were threatening slave rebellion, the secessionists of the Lower South became strangely silent on the question of slavery's future. Through the fall election campaign and in the weeks following the Republican victory, the threat to slavery had been their major argument for secession. But by the middle of January, Republican editors and politicians were falling into line declaring that, far from protecting slavery, secession in fact meant its swift and violent demise. With that, the cooperationists, those who, mostly in the Upper South, initially resisted unilateral secession, turned the tables on the aggressive secessionists from the Cotton States. Echoing the Republicans, Southern cooperationists warned that any state that left the Union would forfeit the protection the Constitution guaranteed to slavery. Worse, they argued, secession invited into the South all the chaos of war and with it the potential uprising of the slaves themselves. Cooperationists had initially argued that if the slave states remained within the Union, they could thwart Republican plans to encircle the South and strangle slavery to death. lacking a Republican majority in Congress, one Kentucky editor had explained, Lincoln, quote, will be powerless if the opposition to him is concentrated and well-directed, end quote. But by January, Southern cooperationists were arguing that secession, far from preventing emancipation, would all but ensure it. Quote, the Constitution of the United States recognizes and protects slavery, a Louisville editor explained. It was the Constitution that had always kept the abolitionists at bay. Take slavery out of the Constitution of the United States, and the entire South would be surrounded by abolitionized state and federal governments. On the other hand, if the border states remain within the Union, quote, slavery will be part of the Constitution and thus under its protection. The Republican banner in Nashville agreed. Slavery, quote, has depended mainly for its existence on the protection afforded by the Constitution. But how will it be after the present government is dissolved and the northern states are absolved from their constitutional obligations, and instead of being parties to the maintenance of slavery, as they are under the Constitution, become its open and avowed enemies? It is clear to be seen that the South will be greatly and fatally weakened by secession, the editors concluded, quote, and the doom of slavery is irrevocably fixed. Did nothing to calm Southern fears. Through the secession winter, he stood firmly with his fellow Republicans in refusing to compromise on the fundamental issues. One of the few reconciliation proposals the Republicans would even consider was that meaningless constitutional amendment recognizing what everybody already recognized, that the federal government could not directly interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. But not even the most conciliatory Republicans would sign on to a sectional compromise that would open the territories to slavery's expansion or recognize a constitutional right of property in slaves. The non-interference amendment that Lincoln and some Republicans were willing to endorse would have done nothing to inhibit their plans for squeezing slavery to death indirectly, and in the unlikely event that it was ratified, states that seceded from the Union would still forfeit whatever protection such an amendment might otherwise have afforded them. Lincoln's lukewarm endorsement of the amendment in his inaugural address was therefore an empty gesture in a speech that stoutly reaffirmed basic Republican positions. He would not interfere directly with slavery in the states where it existed, but neither would he allow its expansion into any Western territories. He would revise the Fugitive Slave Act so that it recognized what he called the privileges and immunities of citizenship to which free blacks were entitled, thus signaling that the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution would be weakened rather than strengthened under his administration. He vowed to recognize all the rights slavery had under the Constitution, but he denied that there was such a thing as a constitutional right of property in slaves, a position nearly all Southerners, secessionists and cooperationists alike, considered scandalous. So Lincoln's inaugural address changed nothing. It brought none of the seceded states back into the Union, and it provoked no new wave of secessions in the Upper South. Nothing Lincoln said was out of line with familiar Republican positions. The national argument over emancipation thus remained where it had stood for several months. The attack on Fort Sumter in the outbreak of war had a more discernible effect. 4 more slave states quickly joined the Confederacy, and with that, the anti-slavery mood among Northerners grew more defiant. For the first time, a small but vocal minority of Democrats joined the Republican chorus in declaring that slavery was doomed. Quote, with the first gun from the rebels in arms, perished every sympathy at the North with slavery, a Democratic editor in Wisconsin explained. Quote, the war cannot now end but with the total extinction of slavery, which was the cause of the war, end quote. Ulysses Grant, who had generally voted, I'm not going to mention Ulysses Grant because Brooks Simpson's going to come up. He knows all about him. Among Republicans, demands for the abolition of slavery became more militant. Lincoln's mailbox began to fill up with letters from across the North demanding the complete destruction of slavery as the price the South must now pay for its treason. And in these letters, a new theme emerged that would recur in the months ahead. If the South forces Northerners to choose between saving the Union and saving slavery, they would not hesitate in answering, quote, "If the people become satisfied, as I think they are, that either slavery or the Union and the Constitution must perish," James Doolittle reported from Wisconsin, quote, "they will preserve the Union and the authority of the Constitution." Southerners must understand, an editor in Roxbury, Massachusetts, declared, quote, "that in the struggle which is impending, their pet institution has got to go under. The rule of the slave power in America is at length ended. It may take several years for the struggle to play itself out, but as a ruling power, its doom is sealed. Slavery's besotted arrogance has proved its ruin," end quote. That was April 1861. The war had barely started, and already it was hard to find a Republican who did not believe that the conflict would end in the complete destruction of slavery. They all believed that Lincoln's election had put slavery on the course of ultimate extinction, but secession had shifted slavery onto a fast track headed toward complete abolition. Lincoln himself may have kept quiet, but he could still read, and he was a good listener. He could not possibly have missed all those predictions of slavery's demise. They were spilling forth from the pens of Republican editors across the North. They were arriving each day in the White House mail, and sometimes in private letters, sometimes increasingly in public petitions. Everywhere, slavery's impending doom was on the lips of Republican elected officials, senators and representatives, governors and state legislators. Lincoln's own cabinet members were pronouncing slavery dead and warning of slave rebellion. Lincoln saw all of this. He heard all of this. It is inconceivable that he, alone among Republicans, didn't believe it. Thank you.
We're running a few minutes late, but we want to take a couple of questions, if there are some. Make them short questions.
Why didn't we know this? Yes.
Yes. Thanks. Could you say a few more words, perhaps, about what was going through William Seward's head during those the months from December to April?
Seward and Chase, among others, both believed that slavery was doomed as soon as Lincoln and the Republicans won in November. Excuse me. Can you hear me? I'll stay over here. Seward believed that slavery was dead with the Republican election of November 1860, so he didn't believe it was necessary to have a war in order to destroy slavery. But he thought if there was going to be a war, what I said, you know, so he affected a conciliatory tone. He threw out a couple of conciliatory proposals, but they were minor proposals. They really, the other one that he threw out, he, for example, included in that January 12th address the constitutional amendment recognizing slavery in the states where it exists. What he says in that speech is, you know, I think the Constitution already recognizes slavery in the states where it already exists, but if it matters to you guys that we put it in the Constitution and make it redundant, all right, we'll do that, right? There was also a proposal that came, it wasn't his idea, that came from a committee, it died in committee, that they wanted to show that they weren't as obstreperous about conciliation as the Democrats were making them out to be. So they said, you know what, let's allow New Mexico to come into the Union under the principles of popular sovereignty, which, of course, the Republicans had repudiated, right? Well, New Mexico had tried to come into the Union as a free state during the Mexican War and wasn't allowed because the Southerners didn't want another free state in. And there were, in 1860, 0 slaves in New Mexico. So we have letters from, like, John Sherman saying, let's do this. Let's do this. That'll show them, you know, it's a bogus proposal, right? So Seward wants to be conciliatory, I think, but he's not willing to buck the basic Republican positions. And what he spells out in that speech seems to me to reflect where the Republicans were at that time. So I don't believe that he was, I think he would like to have been more conciliatory, but I think any time he tried to do it, he got smashed down by other Republicans and by his own constituents.
There's one hand here and one hand here. You wait. Okay, I think you're next now.
Okay. Briefly, Jim. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Where are you? Oh, it's you, Vernon.
All right. Maybe this is a question of clarification.
Sure.
I think I heard you say, or did I hear you say, that Lincoln was relatively silent during the secession winter?
Yes.
Did I hear Professor Burton talk somewhat the other way, that he actually, maybe more quietly, was actually quite active in trying to...
Yes, he's publicly silent, and behind the scenes, he does exactly what Vernon said he was doing. He was sending letters to Elihu Washburn and other people saying, on this fundamental question of slavery's expansion, we won't budge. And that was the issue that was going to make or break any real conciliatory proposal.
Briefly, I'm eager to see where you put Seward in terms of what he would have done if he had been president. We know that he was willing to give up Fort Sumter. He even suggested that crazy scheme of shows how much he knew about the South and the Confederacy. Let's fabricate a war, and all these South Carolinians will rush up to protect New York. But what would he have done? Do you think he'd have let the South go on or not?
I have no idea. I have no idea. He would have, if he had tried to do that, he would have been excoriated. He would have had a lot of trouble with his own constituents. He had floated a conciliation proposal back in November, I think, through Thurlow Weed, and got smashed for it, and that shut him up. Right? It wasn't a proposal that was going to go anywhere either. It was.
There was one more question in the back, and then we're going to have to cut it off.
You know, he wanted a war. Maybe he would have provoked a war. He thought if we have a war, then the South will, you know, it's wave the flag, let's go to war, come back into the Union. Right.
From the evidence you've given today, I take from it that the South understood very well where Lincoln stood on
Yes.
slavery, and
Yes.
they did not misunderstand.
They did not misunderstand. And this goes to a question that someone asked Professor Burton this morning. In a longer version of this, I have quotations from Southern diaries indicating that they were reading the New York Tribune and saying they were getting his stuff in the mail. They were reading it. It wasn't, the South was closed in the sense that it was impossible by the 1850s to have a serious anti-slavery movement in the South. But it wasn't closed in the sense that they didn't know what was going on in the rest of the world, weren't listening, weren't paying attention. Within 2 weeks of that proposal being published in the New York Tribune, Vance is in Congress saying, we have proposals coming from Northern newspaper Republican editors saying this, this, this. They're reading the stuff. They see it. You know, they're not out of touch with reality, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.